Awesome. All right, we have our next presenter, Yasmine Elhagehassan. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Her thesis is titled Assessment of Fugitive Dust Regulations in People. Our thesis advisor is Yasmine Sampson from Dearborn, and her leader is Stephen.
Oh.
You can project the slide. Yeah, that would be helpful.
It's
this.
Thank you so much for attending my presentation. So let's kind of like dive in and like get started. So a bit of background information about why I decided to do this species topic. So we all are familiar with what particulate matter is and what might constitute as particulate matter. But kind of as like a refresher on what particulate matter maybe. You can think of like different sources like dust or like sand particle, like sand, etc. Like anything that's like kind of like a small particle that can like spread throughout an area. That's what particulate matter is. And what kind of, and I think the real question to ask here is what makes it fugitive? So what makes it this fugitive dust unique from what we're familiar with particulate pollution? So the EPA defines particulate matter, fugitive dust, as particulate matter that enters the atmosphere without first passing through a stack or duct designed to direct or control its flow. And there are many ways that particulate matter can become fugitive. And so in the images I've posted up there, there's some examples. So one example is from an industrial truck that could be releasing different products of particulate matter. There's also like stack piles, like over here in this one image of a pet coke pile within near the Detroit River. And there's also like dust that comes from fugitive dust that comes from construction sites as well. So like from the soil that's been exposed, being released into an area. And there are definitely like a lot of like health compilations that definitely make this a more significant issue, especially since there's like varying like concerns with fugitive dust, especially with like how there's different like particle sizes. One of the most concerning being particulate matter like at a micron of 2.5. It can lead to like various health impacts such as asthma or bronchitis or like any like respiratory illnesses or diseases. In setting the scene for our focus on Michigan, I particularly chose this area to focus on for my research because it was definitely like a lot more significant, like thinking about like the general like Midwest like area. Michigan definitely has a lot more like concerning like issues with like concentrations of industrial and transportation activity, mainly within Southeast Michigan. And this calls for like definitely concerned about who's like being like most impacted by like fugitive dust. So the map above is from EPA screen, and it shows like that like people who are like of color or and of low income are more likely to be like impacted by specifically particulate matter 2.5 that could be through like fugitive dust. And there's also like a more recent case of fugitive dust ordinance implementation through Dearborn, Michigan. It is considered to be a landmark ordinance by the city, as it like directly addresses this issue, considering its problems with like concentrated industrial like activities and like industrial trucks going through neighborhoods. This is also like kind of like a personal like area for me as well. I grew up in Dearborn within the East End, and having to be kind of surrounded by construction, industrial trucks going through neighborhoods, it like definitely made me think more about like the area, the city that I live in. So when it comes to regulating fugitive dust, it's very complicated to regulate fugitive dust, not just in terms of like the scope of like determining like what's counting as fugitive dust, how large the area we're considering the spread of various particular substances in the area from different sources. In a way, on the national scale, the Clean Air Act does identify particulate matter as a criteria pollutant. Has in recent like decades been considering like different sizes of particulate matter as a concern, alongside the concern of like dust. However, a lot of these standards don't like that are like set up by the EPA don't like necessarily like consider nuances of fugitive dust. So in requiring like states for like more like a state implementation plan, state of Michigan has standards for fugitive dust control and regulation, which is through their state implementation plan, and also listing provisions under the Michigan air pollution control rules. However, state laws aren't as effective in addressing it on a more local scale, because in the end, state laws are more kind of like the blueprint towards addressing these issues, and it's up to local governments to be able to exactly passing and implementing those like regulations as a lot more effective, as they're more familiar with as each local area is more likely to come across different problems. So in order to answer the question of like how do we go about implementing fugitive dust regulation on the local level, and like how to go about addressing it on a more local scale, these are some of our methodologies that we've done in order to better understand the issue. So in a broader context, a content review helped us assess kind of the overall standing of where Michigan is in terms of this fugitive dust ordinances. So by using Nexus Muni and we searched through the database for like municipal laws and codes of cities and townships in Michigan that have either like maybe like mentioned fugitive dust in some of their like ordinances, or like maybe similar, such as dust control. And I believe over about 76 cities and townships in total have some sort of fugitive dust ordinance or have mentioned fugitive dust as an issue. A lot more suburban urban areas, and through our content area, we discovered that a lot more suburban urban areas in Michigan focus on transportation and industrial materials, so like pet coke and such, as being like more considered areas of fugitive dust, and that's their focus they focus their ordinance on, while more like rural areas are focusing on like more like mining and like zoning, so like more on a like personal smaller scale in terms of fugitive dust control. And this comes to kind of the limitation, as well as though like we focus more on like generally the larger cities, more suburban urban areas of Michigan for this, rather than like a focus on like rural areas and how they're being impacted by fugitive dust. Is also like made us like kind of like question like how like various like different like local areas are defining fugitive dust. A lot of them have defined fugitive dust as more kind of like a public nuisance in the end. In order to like better like sort of understand the way that fugitive dust ordinances are being directly implemented, we did a tri-case study between Chicago, Detroit, Dearborn. I know Chicago is out of state, but it is significant because it is Chicago's fugitive dust ordinance influenced Detroit's fugitive dust ordinance, which influenced Dearborn's fugitive dust ordinance. And in order to get like a better understanding, individual interviews with stakeholders who were involved with these ordinances were interviewed based on like their involvement and like how they perceive these ordinances. So we've observed cumulative impacts, the influence from Chicago to Detroit to Dearborn, and although a lot of interviews were more focused on Dearborn, since it was like, more recent and it's like something that's like I'm more familiar with. However, a lot of the interviews also discussed Detroit's ordinance like hand in hand with Dearborn's ordinance. And so for the purposes of time and such, I would like to go more into Dearborn's case study because I believe this is a very interesting case study out of the 3 cities. So Dearborn's was like over 2 years of 2 to 3 years of like of local like advocacy efforts to get this passed. Dearborn's ordinance passed within 2020. And although its focus is more on industrial trucks and coverage that could be spreading potential fugitive dust within residential areas. So they focus more on like finding and like these like trucks and their companies. And although like that's the final draft, also that's like kind of like more like the final like ordinance that was passed. The draft ordinance is a very different story, and it was more inspired or more like Detroit's fugitive dust ordinance was the framework for the draft ordinance for Dearborn's fugitive dust ordinance, and they could include more sources of fugitive dust. So like it focused a lot on like storage and facilities that could be potentially spreading fugitive dust. And it's actually one of like main like kind of like concerns or criticisms is like of Dearborn's ordinance is that it's very limited in the sources that of fugitive dust that it addresses, and definitely like shows like how it could be better improved upon. So some findings and takeaways that we took from our these methods. We've defined a couple of themes for like both content review and for case studies. Content review, we found a lot of like core components of the ordinance. So we focus on not just how local areas are defining fugitive dust, but also the way that they're going about controlling it. So in a way that it impacts such things like transportation, storage, and the way that facilities conduct and conduct their excuse me, and the way that the facilities like conduct their like coverage of these particular substances. And a lot of them like do like go over or like a lot of it like does bring to question of like what's covered versus what could not be covered in a lot of these ordinances. And there's definitely like interesting like point of like zoning laws being implemented in order to like better like address like different jurisdictions in which fugitive dust spreads to a different area from like different sources. And in the case studies and interviews, we've identified a lot of themes that were like very interesting for the most part. There's like some of the case studies is especially apparent with like within like Dearborn's case, there's a lot of political conflicts within state versus local interests. So like again, this is like an important discussion of like the way that like how state laws like don't extend very far in their enforcement, and how in a way like local enforcement can really like establish and like be more effective in its implementation. Rural community mobilization is very important. We see this through like especially in Detroit's case, that and Dearborn as well, that there's a lot of like community mobilization, you got local advocacy efforts from various like local activists who have pushed hard to have these ordinances implemented, and does like go into like the idea of like how the relations between the city and its local citizens and like competently informing them of these issues. It also is again brings up the theme of environmental justice. Communities who are most impacted by fugitive dust, those who are typically low income, those of color, will most likely like mobilize in order to like fight for better enforcement of these environmental issues. And there's definitely like some themes of like kind of like possible unintended consequences or like loopholes that could be done. So like with Dearborn's orange, again, it lacks like more effective enforcement so far. It's like it mainly like penalizes facilities that like don't comply with the ordinance. And however, there's also like, well, how does this stuff get reported in the first place? How are communities being informed about it? And is it just like these facilities just pay and like get away with it? You know, like I think they're real questions. And this kind of brings us like nearing the end, like the future of fugitive dust policy. So over here is an article of that happened very recently, actually, in relation to Dearborn. Dearborn sued a scrapyard for dust pollution after about 16 citations. So the facility was not in compliance with the Dearborn's fugitive dust ordinance, but also like other like environmental, like also against other environmental standards in place as well. And so the city of Dearborn is suing the scrapyard due to like concerns of dust pollution, mainly coming from its industrial trucks, but also like it could possibly bring up like other sources, especially with the scrapyard itself and how it's being maintained and how like they're preventing different particulate matter substances from flying out there into like residential neighborhoods. So a lot of future dust policy, it's definitely interesting seeing the cumulative effects as states and cities like kind of look into like the different future dust ordinances. So by pressuring and like by like implementing more effective legislation on a local level, we can like see more cumulative effects in ways that like different states or like local communities can address fugitive dust within their area. This also brings up kind of like sort of like limitations of this of the city overall, because fugitive dust is like being more researched as of today. It was defined way back then nearing the establishment of the Clean Air Act. However, it was not as like pushed upon on a national scale. So perhaps like we might see more research being done on environmental and health impacts of fugitive dust, but also ways that we can better control these substances from like spreading like any further. There's also like a need to kind of focus on environmental justice. There's a potential to focus on environmental justice as not just as theme, but also within implementation of policies, as we see in like our cases within 3 cases, specifically like for like Detroit and Dearborn. A lot of like more like at-risk communities were like living near more like industrial like parks, or like more like near like facilities, or like near like major like roadways that have more incoming traffic and industrial trucks. And so they're more likely to like have their health impacted by the fugitive dust that comes in from these sources. And so this comes to a question of like ways that local communities can like mobilize in their advocacy efforts to better legislation of fugitive dust. And that's my presentation. Special thanks to my advisor, Nellie Sampson, my reader, Kimberly Smith, Susan Duvall, Jamie Langdon, and also to all the environmental advocates and my interviews as well. Thank you.
Addressing a problem that doesn't come from the point source that I guess I'm, through regulations moving forward. You're talking about this different kind of dusts have different effects, and where do you think that these things are to focus efforts on? So whether it's a particular type of location or a particular kind of dust, like, what are the things that you think, you know, we're trying to make concrete water, and I know you said safe, there's a lot going on there. Like, what, if you had a wish list, what would be your top priority?
That's actually a very interesting question. Well, definitely like focus more like within like suburban areas and cities, as well, as those are like where you find more activities of fugitive spreading, mainly from industrial sources. Like, I would definitely would say like there's a potential to focus on like transportation as well as a main like source, especially when it comes to, and also especially when it comes to like different sources as well. So like not just on a like industrial scale, but also probably like maybe like on a personal scale as well. Eventually in the future, like seeing like the ways of like personal like vehicles or like different kinds of vehicles like within like traffics can encourage more people thus to go into like different like residential areas and like finding ways to kind of regulate control those.
Interviewees talk at all about. It strikes me that this would be a really difficult spent, just because air pollution in general is difficult to get evidence that there's air pollution. It's always persistent. And this just seemed like an enforcement nightmare. Did your interviews talk about that at all?
They have brought up enforcement issues. And remember, like since they're more focused on like Dearborn, there's definitely a lot of enforcement issues with Dearborn. Again, it's like the way that like they conduct like permitting facilities from like polluting like areas with particulate like matter of fugitive dust. There's also like concerns of like how they're going about finding these facilities as well, and like kind of like in a way finding these facilities and trying to like have them like develop better standards and control over releasing is like there is definitely like also like discussion of like the way the city is like informing communities as well of ways to report these issues. So there's also like kind of in general like lack of a communication with residents about where they can report violations of the ordinance. So that's definitely like one like issues as well when it comes to enforcement of the ordinance.
So